there. Good evening. I'm Jessica Thomas. I am the facilitator of the MS Mental Wellness Chat, and tonight we are going to be talking about healing through grief and loss. And we're going to thank Viatris for their support for tonight's program. They have been a supporter of the MS Views and News Mental Wellness Chat for a good while now. We're so thankful for their support. We'll move forward. Okay, so I wanted to frame this. You are not alone. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about grief and loss. And we're going to talk a little bit about MS and grief and loss and navigating this. And I just want you to know that you are not alone, even no matter what you're experiencing. I think it's one of the hardest things and often most common things is that we feel like we are alone or we're navigating something by ourselves. And this mental wellness chat gives you a safe place to know that that is not the case. So what is grieving? So grieving is what we're going to talk about today, and we're going to explore grief. And we'll move on to the next slide. So we're going to not only explore this in the like the context of losing someone that you love, but it's also in experiencing physical or cognitive or identity related losses that come with illness or transitions in life. So we're going to not talk about this essentially in abstract. We're going to talk about in real ways that it shapes our bodies, our minds, and our lives, kind of how the experience is. Often when we talk about grief, we just talk about it as in like a death of a loved one. And but it's just often so much more than that. It's the little losses. And when I think about it with MS, and we'll talk a little bit specific to MS, it's how MS can challenge some of the ways that we were into the ways that we are now, some of the losses. Now, we also gain a lot sometimes, and I know that's a weird perspective, and I'll share that later. But we also can gain, some positive things too. But often the reality is that we have, a significant amount of losses with MS. So I want you to think of grief. It's kind of like walking into a storm. You can't avoid it, but you can learn to walk through it with the support, the tools, and a little bit of hope. And so we're going to look at how we process emotions, build support, and ultimately how we move forward. So I'm going to give you a first visual. And I would like for you to think of grief in this context. So my son plays baseball, but this will be his last year playing baseball. I usually use a tennis ball, but I found baseballs for this analogy. So right here is if this baseball could represent what grief can feel like at first when it's in your face. It touches every single part of this jar for the most part. And I can tell you it's going to be a monster for me to get this baseball out of this jar because it barely fit in. And that's how grief can feel sometimes. And so what I want to do is to know that you might be in a place where grief feels like this, where you kind of just sort of move and it touches everything. Over time, what happens with grief, if it's processed, if you allow it to be present when it needs to be present, if you have healthy coping mechanisms, is that you grow around the grief. So if you can, imagine the baseball being the grief, and you see how much more space there is. And if you can just imagine this jar as like a jar that keeps evolving, so you grow around. The grief doesn't change. It doesn't shrink in size, nor can we just make the grief go away. That's why I like this, because if I tried to take this baseball out right now, you guys would see me struggle. I wouldn't be able to get it out. So just to kind of hold that as sort of a context. So we'll move on to our next page. Actually, if we can go back, I'm sorry, we were up one. So if you can think about grief as being something that's like just go back one more, sorry, a natural response to loss. Oh, I'm sorry, we're going forward. If we can go like two back. So grief is, yes, that's the perfect one. And so it's not linear. It's something that has ebbs and flows. And the last thing I'll say, or an example I'll give you about grief. So we often think that grief is like a straight line, right? That you go through all the stages, the 5 stages of grief, and you're done. No, this is grief. It's messy and it's complicated. And so I just want you to know that that grief kind of feels a little bit messy sometimes, and that's a normal response. But it's not a linear thing. And how I grieve might be different how you grieve. And grief is not something that we get over. And so it's something, a way, that moves us, we move through it. And we may have feelings. It may show up as sadness. It may show up as exhaustion or even pain. And how learning how we react and respond to grief is part of the important thing to do. And it can be a whole body experience. Grief can cause fatigue, can be challenging. I think it's, an analogy would be, it could be like carrying a backpack with, invisible rocks. And you may not notice it at first, but over time you might notice the weight of it. Um, I wanted to give you guys an example. Excuse me, a real example. So my grandparents both had passed away, one a long time ago and one within the year. And this weekend, or last weekend, I went to Boston and for work, and I was able to bring home a lot of beautiful things from my grandmother. And going through and bringing home those things really woke up some of the grief that was inside of me and some of the amount that I missed her and missed my grandfather very much. And when I got home, my fatigue level was incredible. Incredible. I slept most of the day when I got home. I slept most of the second day. And so grief is something, that can really affect fatigue even. And just kind of being kind to yourself and acknowledging, but these are things that we all experience. So let's talk about different types of loss. So there can be losses with physical changes. Like with MS, I think sometimes the diagnosis might feel like the first loss. If you have had changes in your mobility, your independence, there can be cognitive changes or losses with MS, with your memory, your concentration, or even how you identify with yourself. Your relationship and your roles, your relationships might change. And then the future hopes and expectations. I know that when I was first diagnosed, I'm going to ask what your feelings were. But when I was first diagnosed, I was newly married. Remember, I was married. I've been married for 21 years, and at 20 years ago, I was diagnosed. I was less than a year married. And I remember being really sad about kind of not being able to know what the future would look like and grieving that. What is something that you grieved when you were first diagnosed? What did you perceive as a loss? For me, it wasn't. It was really about the future that I grieved for. Now, if I could look back, I would be really kind to myself and say that I was able to do a lot that I wanted to do still. So I'm going to let you guys kind of answer that. What is something that you grieved? But there's different losses, and losses are just not about death. They can be the loss of so many things like health, abilities, or even what we thought things would look like. And I remember, even in my time as being a therapist, working with women, and there was actually a lot of people that said, I really, I grieve the loss of not being able to wear high heels and my dress shoes, and it sounds silly, right, to say it, but it's not silly, and it's something that probably many people can identify with. And yes, there's other cute flat shoes that people can wear and stuff, but it was a grief that I think a lot of the women I worked with experienced. Okay. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit. So Kenneth shares, I love this image. It makes me think how sand irritates an oyster, but as the oyster goes through that irritation, it creates a pearl. That is beautiful. Meg says, my ability to pursue the career that I wanted. And that is a real loss that many people have experienced. Megan says, I love this quote, and I'm not sure the reference anymore, but it says something like a burden, like grief shared, is halved, and a joy shared is doubled. That is beautiful, Megan. Thank you for sharing. Rick said, I just went through a divorce and alone, and that's a big loss to experience. And Rick said that. Kenneth said, I'd never seen grief this way before, but it makes sense. Lucy says, I have no idea the diagnosis, how much I would lose. Stephanie says, I grieved my future a lot too, feeling uncertain. Kimberly said, the doctor told me I couldn't exercise or rock climb anymore. I was a police officer and couldn't run anymore. I felt a lot of my choices were taken away. I grieved losing options. Sandy says, at loss of independence, gave up my car last year. I have to depend on people for simple things like going to the post office. Paula says, I felt like my life was over. My neurologist back then just said meds and thousands of dollars, and he said goodbye. I was 52, now 62. I made peace with God that day, loss of job and divorced. Angela says some fun physical activities that I'm unable to participate in with my daughters. And then I have someone who just said that they have just the loss of independence. And grief looks different for all of us, and losses look different for each of us too. And the truth is that there's a lot. It's complex. We'll move on to our next slide. And we're going to talk a little bit about common reactions to grief. So common reactions may be feelings like sadness, anxiety, anger, fatigue, not sleeping well or sleeping too much, isolation or withdrawal, questioning meaning and purpose. We'll go back on the other slide, please. So if you felt these reactions, it's important to know that you're not alone. These are common and they're normal parts of grieving. Even like when people, like we might have people in our lives, people in our, in our world that think we should just move on and move through. Please know that grief kind of comes in many forms, and at the same time, it's so complex. You might have grief that kind of goes away, and like I, shared with my example of getting, going and bringing things home from my grandparents' house. Grief revisited me, and sadness, and I just had to welcome it and in for a couple of days. So do know that that it can be a common reaction. So we talked a little bit about grief not being linear. Many people visit emotions multiple times. And each journey is very unique. So I think it's so important. So we all, it seems like from the people that are participating in the chat, and not everyone does, but the people that are, and I believe the people that are not participating probably can identify some of those feelings of grief and how they have felt, with grief. And even with MS specifically or chronic disease, grief can come back, so you might have when relapse hits or progression hits without a relapse, when you kind of realize, reflect, oh gosh, I've had a continuous decline over the years, or or you have a relapse and you have to make a treatment change. Grief can really show up again. I'm going to read a couple of the comments. Barbara said, my decrease in mobility bothers me. My ability to drive has lessened, and I often feel like I'm stuck at home. Also, my friends have become less in numbers. It's been like a roller coaster of emotions. I think it's so important to have a place to be able to process those, those feelings, definitely. Kimberly says it's 28 years and it still hits me. Absolutely, it hits me maybe, if I have increased symptoms out of nowhere. I start to feel, that sense of anxiety that comes with the grief a little bit. And then Amelia says, I think that people think about me differently because I can't do many things many times. I know that much of this is something that I put on myself. And then Kenneth says seasonal reminders can come in and out like the tides. That is so true. How many of you experience a little bit of grief when there's seasonal reminders? Like for me, in the summer, it's hotter. It's not as energetic for me. It's busiest for my work season, but it's the hardest for me physically and probably cognitively and just like emotionally. So I am very right aligned with that seasonal reminder. Does anyone else have seasonal reminders too? Let me see, and I'm going to go down. So we had a couple. Rick says yes. Stephanie says yes. Anna said, sad to lose my ability to hike, dance, jump, run, farm, or walk with ease. Absolutely. Amelia says yes. Anna says, sad to be immunocompromised from Ocrevus, which limits socializing with friends. And then Meg says, absolutely, I want to participate in summer activities with friends, and I can't handle the heat. Yeah, it's kind of tricky. So let's move on to our next slide, and we're going to talk. So some of you may have heard about the 5 stages of grief. We're not going to go into each stage, but it's just important to know that grief is messy, and you may feel, a sense of, anger. You might have acceptance. You might have denial. You might be bargaining. Those stages were created as a model to help people, but people, it's not linear. Remember, it's a mess. It's a mess. You're going to go through it maybe a couple of times. You're going to revisit different stages, and it's kind of more like the weather. How the weather can be a little bit, calm one day, but kind of unpredictable the next, and then you can, feel yourself circling back. So we'll move on to our next slide, and we're going to talk about grieving, specifically physical changes. So, sorry. So I have a chat box question. It goes with a little bit with the question that I asked you earlier, but which type of loss has been the most challenging for you? Or if you're a care partner for someone that you know with MS. So which type of loss? So I will say, so this is separate than talking about a diagnosis, but I would say that as a therapist, what I've seen to be the most difficult for people is the loss of working, because the loss of working sometimes can attach to people's feelings of what their purpose is, even though your purpose shouldn't be your job, but you often do that. So that's, I would say, and then probably personally is the fatigue and cognition, just because they're frustrating and they take so much energy to manage. As we have people chime in, I'm going to read some of the chat box to catch us up. So Barbara says, summer, the heat and humidity is hard, so she has some seasonal. Lisa says, I'm grateful that I have 4 seasons, but it's difficult with the changes. And then Rick says, sometimes all at once. Meg says, in response to this, losing my memory and cognitive ability. Rick says, cognitive issues and stamina. Lucy says, loss of a career as a therapist. Kenneth says, always balancing what I want to do with what I can do. Isn't that the truth, right? And loss of relationships. Paula says, walking without a walker, and my job and driving. Julie says, driving and working. Terry says, walking. Amelia says, for my daughter, it was not being able to work full time. Janet says, intermittent optic neuritis that robs me of sight for some indeterminate amounts of time, so that unpredictability and not being able to know. Terry says loss of independence. Vicky says, I'm grieving not wanting to date because I don't want to discuss MS in the future. That's a very, a real thing for, people that have been, single that I've talked with over the years. Melissa says, loss of independence. And then Lisa says, I have a great opportunity to enter a second chapter in my life with purpose as long as I stay on course. I've met a great nonprofit MS organization. That is so cool. Stephanie says, I struggle with pacing myself. So you can see that there's challenges, right? So we'll move forward to the next slide, and we're going to talk a little bit about grieving those physical challenges because we need to. I think one of the most important things is that we give space, because if we don't give space, if you can think about this visualization, if we don't give space to grieve whatever it is when it's happening in the moment, then what is going to happen is that we won't get to grow around it. The grief just stays and takes over everything or touches everything. Okay, we're going to move on to our next slide. I think we're going to move on. Okay, I'm going to just start to talk about, I believe my slide changer is busy. We're going to talk about grieving physical changes. This will move over one more slide, please. And we're going to talk just a little bit about the loss of mobility, the strength or independence. You've heard those all in the chat box from people. Adjusting to new limitations. The great thing is we have the opportunity to adjust, and we have the opportunity to redefine identity. But who wants to do that immediately, right? Who wants to? We have to give space to grieve it. And when your body changes, we have to give space to grieve that the life that we had before. And this is a valid type of grief. Allowing space to mourn these changes, and it's really a step towards accepting. And when you're losing, independence in either movement or, function, it to me, sometimes it attaches to dignity. And so we've heard the example here, someone that, loved walking and running and doing things, will grieve when they, and will rightfully so grieve when they have to rely on a walker. So, and if you could think about the analogy behind this, I'm full of analogies today, but, if you think about, how like freely you were able to move, and now you bump into barriers every time, that grief is really real. And so what I think is important to do is that if you have, grieving physical changes that you've experienced, to name it. It's okay. Now, I don't know if it's really helpful. Actually, I do know it's not helpful. I'll correct that. To grieve changes that haven't happened. If you are, we're in our own chapter book of living with MS, including myself. And I think early on, I was focused on what chapter 89 and 90 looked, although I was living in chapter 4 or 5 in my chapter book of living with MS. And so grieving the losses is, it is, I needed to grieve the unknown and accept that would be the unknown would be a part of it. But it's important to not stay in chapter 90 if you're not there, because then that robs you of where you are in the moment. So we're going to move on next to grieving cognitive challenges and cognitive changes. And the cognitive changes can be, a couple of things. It can, be like short-term memory lapses, difficulty concentrating, losing a sense of yourself or in your role. For me, a lot of cognitive stuff is related directly to fatigue. I'm not sure if that's the if that is your experience as well, but the cognitive changes can be very frustrating for me. And I've made some accommodations through the years to I feel like I give the best verbal game of charades when I'm trying to think of a word. I can't, pull really quickly, and I'll give all the examples, explain it, and be super excited when the person, says the word that I was thinking of. But those things, it took some time to actually grieve them to be okay where they are now. Okay, so we have Anna, who has shared, sad of loss for working with my friends from our farm. However, I love making art full time my way, um, way more than my last role at the farm. The challenge of mastering oil painting keeps me going. That is so cool. And Anna, stay posted because next month we're going to talk about creativity. And then also the potential for disability inspired me to leap into making art full time. What a blessing. And then Megan says, I used to be the person that everyone relied on, and now I can't take care of myself. It can be, it can be such an adjustment, right? And then I think with MS, the day to day can be, a little bit better. The season from season can be very different. It really is person to person how it impacts. But it's one of the most frustrating parts of this disease. So, cognitive changes, either, whether from like your illness, treatment, or aging, mostly, we're going to talk about it from the context to MS. It can feel completely humbling and really threaten how you see yourself. And I think naming the grief here is important to help reduce the shame and permission to process it. And to me, that's one of the most important things is, because if you have cognitive changes, it doesn't make you less smart. It doesn't mean that you're not intelligent. It means that, for me, it means I need to rest, or I'm trying to multitask in a world where we really need to single task instead. And but you have to own it first and own the grief that comes with it. Now, when you name the grief around it, it can kind of soften it and soften the shame. I think in the cognitive piece, we can easily shame ourselves for cognition or cognitive challenges that one may experience. And when you name kind of how you feel about it, it can help sort of soften the shame part of it, which is almost doing like double bad for yourself when you're talking in a role of shame. So let's move on to the next slide, and we're going to talk a little bit about healthy processing strategies. So when we're processing, we are not avoiding. It means creating outlets like art, like creating, like journaling, like practicing mindfulness or meditation, talking with friends. It's helping us to deal with some of the emotions so they don't stay bottled up. Because if they stay bottled up, if you can, I feel like I'm on an analogy kick today, but if you think about a volcano, and if you could think about a volcano kind of representing your emotions and grief, if you don't do things to vent, what happens over time is there's so much pressure that builds that there's like an explosion. So, or you could also think about it like a pressure cooker, but we've got to release, and the release is through coping. And those coping strategies are as different as I am different from you, and we're different from each other, but it's finding the things that work for you to help you to get out the emotion. And it can be, as significant and easy as like a creative thing that you're doing versus verbally telling somebody. I'm going to read a little bit from I struggle to help my mother in a wheelchair. She needs warmer temps that I can't tolerate is what my thinking is. Excuse me. That can be really challenging when your loved one needs different temperatures than you do. And I know for me, when the warmer it gets, the less my cognitive function, like while I'm able to do everything I'm able to do, it lessens. I'm more cognitively fatigued. And then Amelia says, it's humbling, but now I can be more compassionate for other people. Absolutely. Meg asked, how do you find healthy outlets? So I'm going to ask you guys, how do you find your outlets? And I'll tell you about a little bit about professionally what ways to find outlets as well. But I'm interested because I think people can help people so much with their ideas. So healthy outlets, if you're looking even at this slide right here, and you think about like journaling or creative expression, you try journaling and maybe you try to see if it's something that relaxes you. The other day for one of my friends was grieving a different loss, and I said, why don't I come over and we can watercolor flowers? And I have a book, and we can just do that. And she's not super artsy, but I knew that the act of doing something would be relaxing and not stressful for her, because I knew she wouldn't feel stressed out about it. So we did that, and that was a creative expression for her to, and we talked as we were painting as well. Um, Mindfulness and meditation. There's a lot of apps and tools that can help you with this. I love the idea of just mindful breathing, taking a walk, if you can. If you're not able to take a walk, I also spend a lot of time on my back porch, just kind of breathing in and out, doing just a nice rhythmic breathing, and also paying attention to all the beautiful things outside that I can see from my porch. And looking at sunsets, those sort of things. Physical activity, for me, gentle movement, walking, stretches, those kind of things seem to be helpful. And for many, they are, in talking with people. But I think it's exploring what works for you, and you won't know unless you try different things. I think it's also very helpful to go through a counselor, and work with a counselor as well, because that can help you to try different things. And when I was doing therapy with people, we would try things and they would have homework and they would try it for like a week and they come back and tell me, okay, that worked for me or that didn't work for me. Okay, we're going to move to the next slide, and we're going to talk about a little bit about what to avoid. We're going to go one more forward, please. And we're going to talk a little bit about what to avoid. We want to avoid suppressing emotions because we don't want grief to stay bigger and stay, as big. We want to grow around it. And an only way to grow around it is if we talk about it, or we work on, okay, I'm sad. When I told you the experience of this weekend, I shared that made me, it just kind of woke up some of the grief I had. I was sad. We don't want to isolate ourselves, even though that might be the very thing that feels the most comfortable to do. If you are wanting to isolate yourselves away from everybody, ask yourself why, and ask yourself, is that healthy? And would you advise a friend in your situation to do that? Often we'll give friends the best advice, and it's harder for us to do that for ourselves. So we want to avoid numbing with alcohol or substances, just to kind of numb the feeling, because we don't want to, so we don't want to suppress the emotion. We don't want to pretend like it's not there, and we don't want to numb it. I'm okay with distracting it a little bit and processing through it, distracting it a little bit, with a good conversation or having a little bit of fun. But we also don't want to create this toxic positivity where we minimize how we're feeling, or go to on the bright side. I'm all about resetting and reframing and everything, but we want to honor how we feel, and that's okay. Give it space. I would say give it a seat at the table, and because you do that doesn't mean that it takes all the attention, but it can be there for a little bit while it needs to be there. Paula says, I found a great journaling system, which is led by therapists. Music also helps. Renee says, exercise helps me stay focused. I also listen to meditation at bedtime. We have Amelia that says, guided breathing and expressions of gratitude is helpful for me. And Rick, I'm so good, proud of you. Like, you have never had to, you never got involved in those other substances, because it really can, that numbing is just not healthy. and not beneficial to the process, and actually just complicates the process. And as humans, it's important to know that we want to avoid pain at all costs. But by pushing the grief away, we're going to have it resurface later, and it likely will resurface much stronger. And healing, working through, requires acceptance and acknowledgement. So we'll move on to our next slide. And we're going to talk a little bit about resilience building. So the mental wellness chat, the mental health, mental wellness chat, we talk a lot about resilience. So I want you to know that if you're new to the chat, you may be like, gosh, she didn't really talk about resilience a lot. Please go back to the MS Views the News channel on YouTube and know that we have a lot of resilience, and know that I'm going to continue to talk a lot about resilience too. So it's one of my favorite topics, and it's integrated into everything that I do. So when we're building resilience around grief, we're focusing on what's within your control. This might be celebrating small victories. This might be reframing challenges as growth opportunities. And it's not about being tough. It's about being really flexible, allowing yourself to bend without breaking, find meaning even within the struggle. I'm trying to, let me look for something real quick, if I can grab it. For example, resilience is the muscle that we learn that kind of helps us to bend a little bit in a big storm if we were a tree, like it, that we won't break. Like it just allows us to kind of be able to cope. So I'm going to share just out of like fun. This is my attempt at cosmos, my first attempt. If you know how to draw cosmos or you love cosmos, you'll understand they're really beautiful flowers, very delicate. And I took a picture when I was out of town around my grandmother's, and I wanted to paint it. That was a way that I processed through some of my sadness from that trip. It's just to kind of like focus on some of the beautiful things that I saw and that I felt that weekend. But knowing that resilience is in your control. I'm going to read. So Amelia says. I'm sorry, Amelia says that music helps a good bit. Janet says, I love coloring when I'm really stressed. And so thinking about the things that you do when you're stressed, if you create, then probably creating might help. But knowing that you can use the things that help you to be resilient when you are experiencing grief. And then there's the role of hope. We'll move on to our next slide. So it's important to know that hope can coexist with grief. It can live right beside it. And it really can involve in a shift that may be from I'm going to cure this to I'm going to have the best quality of life possible. Even small sources of joy matter. And that's important. And that's another aspect of resilience, is finding those small sources of joy. The picture of the cosmos is like a little example, and then my attempt to draw them when I got back home. But finding those little things of joy that give you a sense of hope. And hope is not it's not denial, it's adapting. And when our circumstances change, our definition of hope can change too. It can look a little bit different. And hope is not having everything work out. Hope sometimes is simply having one nice, good moment in a difficult day. And so that's, I think an important part is that hope can coexist within grief. And that's an important thing, because we want to have hope regardless. We'll move on to our next slide, and we're going to talk a little bit about asking for help. So it's important to have support networks and to ask for help when needed. And this is important, and it's important to be specific about your needs when you're asking for help. Accept help when it's offered. This is such a tough thing for people, including me sometimes. And Hold on one second. I'm going to read some of these comments in a second. And asking for help is a strength, not a weakness. We need to rewrite the experience of asking for help. So we have Angela says, exercise, music, and a good night's rest, taking a cool shower, listening to audiobooks, watching my favorite stand-up comedian on YouTube. Those are things that that are resilient and helpful and hopeful. Meg says, what is your favorite small source of joy? Probably my favorite small source of joy is seeing flowers, because I have trained my eyes to look for flowers. So I easily can find just even little wildflowers when I'm on a walk. So you guys tell me, what is your favorite small source of joy? I've asked you in previous chats before, but that's a good thing to share, because when you share joy, and we're going to talk about this in a second, when we share things, it helps other people. And we have Kenneth here that says, bad things happen to everyone. How we respond to adversity is what defines us. He said there's joy in art, written, music, painting, sculptures, etc. So again, answer, what is a small joy for you? We're going to talk a little bit about helping others in grief. Move on to the next slide. So when we're helping others that are grieving, it's important to listen more than we talk, to be practical and to be patient. But if you're supporting someone who's grieving, it's the most important thing is it's not something that we can fix. Presence matters, and words. And let's move 2 slides forward as we're waiting for the small joys from people. Anna says cooking for my people. Lucy says seeking bees and butterflies on my plants in my yard. And Millie says one source of joy is my dog snuggled up beside me. That is great. Continue to add in your joys. But when you're connecting with other people and you're sharing things like a small joy, and connecting, it actually is something that can be helpful. There's also, I recently saw something on social that I thought was interesting. I do this and practice this for my social media, but there's actually an app that tracks this. You can have an app that has like a gratitude tracker that you send like with a group of friends that you guys can just share your gratitudes. And I love that, because the point of it is that when you share your gratitude, they share their gratitude. It might be a picture, it might be a statement, a thing. When you do that, the other person feels good. How I do it is I usually will send one picture on social media, or put one picture on social media that made me happy for the day. It might be a beautiful moon, or flowers that I saw, or something I created, or my dog Charlie, who's really funny. So making sure that you're sharing those gratitudes and those small joys with people in your community and in your network really can help, because not only is it good for you because you stop and you notice it, it's good for the other person as well. So when should you seek professional help when you're dealing with grief? I know for myself, when I was grieving at my diagnosis, I sought professional help because I had uncontrolled anxiety, and a lot of it was related to my grief with MS. But if you're having changes in your sleeping, your eating, your quality of life, your moods, that's one of the telltale signs. Talk to your doctor about it. If you're not having the same ability to function in your day-to-day world on the same level, if you're engaging in harmful coping behaviors, those coping behaviors that kind of numb things instead of approaching that, or if you're feeling stuck. So feeling kind of stuck in that grief. So there's one thing to feel the grief, to accept it for the moment. But if you're, going a long period after that and you just feel like you're not moving through it, you're feeling like this, not like you're getting somewhere like this. Now, this takes a while to get there. But if you're feeling that way, that's a good time to see a counselor. Because sometimes grief can be paralyzing, and it can make you feel like you're not functioning. And let's move forward. Let's go 2 slides. So healing doesn't erase a loss, or it doesn't erase the grief that you experience. Many of us, when we're experiencing grief and the process of grief, we will get something positive from it. We'll get post-traumatic growth, and that we may learn more resilience skills. We may learn those small joys to tap into those. We may learn, acceptance of our emotions. But there can be things that we can get through the healing journey that can be incredibly and positive for you and helpful later on in life. And it's really neat when we get to here, the pain softens a little bit and space for joy returns. And grief becomes integrated into your life. Again, the baseball remains the same size. And healing doesn't erase the loss, it just changes your relationship with it. We're going to move on to two more slides forward. Actually, go one more slide backwards. Sorry. I'm sorry, Bill. I know we're a couple minutes out, so I'm trying to pick all the good stuff. So practical tools for daily coping. So I want you to think of your breathing exercises, your gratitude journaling, creating a daily routine. It doesn't have to be a rigid routine. Actually, I prefer it not to be a rigid routine. And limiting things that are overwhelming or toxic, the things that are unnecessary for your mental wellness. And let's talk a little bit about the next slide. So move forward. To know that healing is possible. You can carry grief and still carry meaning. And the goal here is not to get over it, it's to be able to live fully with it. And when the grief doesn't vanish, it kind of becomes a part of your story. So if you think about, this baseball being MS, and I'll just use it for my own life because it's easy. My life, MS is a part of it, and it's kind of a big part of it, but it's not all of my life. And that's the same for many people and all the different types of grief. Hope isn't moving on, it's moving forward with grief alongside you. And we'll move forward to the next slide. So in closing, grief is valid and it's complex. Processing it takes courage and compassion, and it's important to know that you're not alone. I'm going to read a couple things. Renee says, healthy eating balances my emotions. Healthy eating is definitely a part of our emotional wellness. Oh, yeah, Amelia said that this is so good. She's been encouraged by an author. The author is Kate Bowler, and I actually have a couple of her books here in my office. And she wrote a book, Have a Beautiful, Terrible Day. She also, she wrote two more books, and I'm not going to go grab them behind me, but I have Kate Ballard. I literally have two books. I don't want to. One is about this is cognition now. One is just about that there's no everything. You know how people say everything happens for a reason. Oh, that's what it is. The book is called Everything That Happens for a Reason in Other Lives That I've Loved. So finding those things that give you that sense of of encouragement too. And Kate Ballard is a really good person to get that from. And it's important to know she's a cancer survivor, and so cancers can be a chronic illness sometimes, and so a lot of what she says is very, very relevant to the MS community as well. We're going to thank Viatris again for their support. Remember, you are not alone. And one more slide. I always end with this slide, and I think I will always continue to end with this slide. We're not saying goodbye. We're saying we'll see you later. Have a great evening, and I will see you next month.